Kia ora koutou, welcome to Top Talks. This week I have with me Monique from Generation Zero. Just a quick bit of housekeeping. Of course, if you're in Wellington, remember we have the brand relaunch on October the 3rd, 6 p.m. at McKeown Bar. Hope to see you there. So of course, this week, prior to the brand relaunch, is the Strike for Climate. So that's happening this Friday, the 27th of September. And so we thought we'd talk with one of the many young people who are younger people involved in this incredible movement that we are seeing across the nation and across the world with the Strike for Climate movement. So kia ora, Monique, welcome along.
Kia ora, Geoff.
And so Monique, how did you first get into Generation Zero?
So thinking back when I was at school, climate change was still being talked about as, do we believe in it or not? And then thinking about it now and just seeing the millions of kids at school and all taking action on it, it's amazing. So I first got involved in it through the Zero Carbon Act campaign. And
so just before the 2017 election sort of time?
About halfway through last year, so
okay, cool.
It was when the Zero Carbon Act was coming...
Oh, being talked about,
So it was actually an event at Parliament where the draft bill had just been carried by bike from the length of the country to Parliament, and I was there and I was just so amazed to see these young people and what they'd done, and I wanted to be part of creating that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And congratulations, by the way. I mean, in case you don't know, Generation Zero was really responsible for the Zero Carbon Bill, really pushing it from, for several years before the 2017 election, such to the point where the majority of political parties in 2017 had it as part of their manifestos.
Yeah.
So really, a really successful campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. And it started from a group of Generation Zero people being over at the Paris climate talks, and they saw that New Zealand signing up for the agreement, and then on coming back to New Zealand, looked around and felt there wasn't enough of a youth voice, and they were sitting around in a cafe and went, what can we do? And set about thinking, oh my goodness, could we write a draft bill? And they did, and now we're here. Awesome.
So yeah, I mean, it sort of draws on the ideas from overseas, doesn't it, of countries like the UK, I think, that have that sort of legislation in place, really to provide a plan to get us to zero emissions is the idea of the Zero Carbon Act. So tell me, how does it feel being part of Generation Zero and having this even younger cadre of people coming along and because 5 years ago or so, Generation Zero, everyone was like, wow, these young people doing amazing things, and now we've got 8-year-olds.
Absolutely. It is very inspiring to see what these younger people are doing, but also there's a part of me that feels that they shouldn't have to be doing this. An 8-year-old, or even for myself, we have so many dreams of what we want to do, and so many young people are having to put that on hold because it's so important. This work is so important.
Yeah, I'll come back to that. I mean, have the people of Generation Zero talked about retiring now that there's the School Strike for Climate movement come along? Or?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I believe that we need everyone to solve climate change. Everyone creates emissions, from government to big corporations to individuals. So if someone isn't doing something to lower their emissions, somebody else is just going to have to carry that load.
Yeah.
So there's such a place for all the different voices that are coming through. We need everyone doing a little bit here to...
Yeah. And do you guys actually talk about your respective roles? Like what's the role of, you know, do you try to coordinate with school strikes, or maybe a group like Extinction Rebellion, who've, you know, another new force on the scene? Do you guys talk with each other about, you know, we'll do this, you'll do that, getting clear on what your different roles are?
There definitely is some liaison, because we don't want to create events over the top of events, and if our values align with another group, then we'll want to amplify it, or sometimes our voice might not be the voice that needs to be heard within a space. Like you say, there's so many different groups arising. There's Indigenous groups like Te Arawhatu, who are a youth climate change group, started to go to the United Nations talks. So yeah, sometimes Generation Zero might not be the best voice. So yeah, it's all about working together.
Yeah, and so the new Generation Zero campaign is all about talking to your elders.
Yeah, so that's a perfect example, Geoff. We collaborated with School Strike for Climate, and we did a joint campaign.
Yeah.
Elbow Your Elders. So. Elbow Your Elders. That's right. Yeah, to get the younger generation talking to the older generation about climate change. And I think that's one of the areas that Generation Zero have been really successful, is breaking down policy, and we've had such a sort of strong policy component, but how we break that down and communicate that to people and speak to people's values to be able to get people on board. And that's what we saw with the Zero Carbon Act campaign, is that we had an idea, but the space was right for all these groups to come on board.
Yeah, I've really noticed that with, I mean, Generation Zero has been excellent at coming up with really tangible ideas for how to move things forward. And I guess what School Strike for Climate has brought into the conversation is just some really raw emotion, you know, like you know, these young kids speaking from their hearts on the issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, speaking of that, I mean, you mentioned before looking at all of these young people giving up their time because they don't see you know, a future necessarily without sorting out climate change. I mean, how do you feel about it personally, if you don't mind me asking? You know, what's your personal kind of view of the future, or how does it make you feel?
Yeah, I think there's been times when I have felt very frustrated because I just want to do this thing, and then it feels like I can't because climate change is here and that requires my attention. And then I think we just have to acknowledge where we are and go forward and like sort of acknowledge where we are, to then be able to not feel in fear and in panic, and actually be able to speak to and start to solve the problem, so we can, and you know, my children, my grandchildren will be able to live out the dreams that maybe I don't get to.
Right.
So
yeah, so I mean, I guess that sort of messaging stuff is a careful balance, right? I mean, we've got this big issue, this massive issue, this potentially existential issue.
Yes.
But on the other hand, we don't want to freak people out too much, because that can get people to shut down and kind of start to just, you know, worry about themselves or look, you know, inwards rather than at the greater good. Yeah,
absolutely. I think I even wrote a note about this. Yeah, I think, like I said, it's about acknowledging that it exists, and from a position of fear and anxiety, we can't do anything about it.
Right.
So I think for me it's about putting myself in a strong position so that I can take action, and I can help educate and enable other people to take action so that they're not sitting in that space of fear either.
Yeah. So we kind of have to be a bit afraid because we have to be motivated, but
absolutely,
but not overcome with it, so that, because that can cause inaction. So yes, we've got this big issue, but there's also something we can do about it. You're trying to show positive.
Absolutely, it's about sharing the vision of what we can create.
Yeah.
Even if climate change wasn't real, but we still implemented all the solutions to climate change, we'd have, I believe, a much richer, more caring, kind society. So yeah. Any
particular favourite part of that future vision that you look forward to the most? I mean, I'm an avid cyclist. I have to put up disclose my favoritism of that particular mode of transport. But when you're looking forward to that future, positive vision of the future that you see, is there anything in particular that inspires you?
It's a good question. My dream, I guess, as a young child was to make costumes, and that's the work that I currently do, and also
the New Zealand Ballet.
Royal New Zealand Ballet, and also I have wanted to travel overseas to study dance for a year, and that is something I've put on hold. So yeah, being able to sort of allow the time to create those things that are not a baseline but a top line. So I think things like art and dance, you're striving for something more. So being able to work in those spaces. We're currently working in that space, and the whole textile industry, I know that I'm just contributing to the problem, and so that's something that's sometimes hard to reconcile. Yeah.
So for a lot of people, they might not think about the textile industry as contributing to the problem. What do you do you have an example of one way that the textile industry contributes to the problem? Or?
Well, fossil fuels. About 60% of the clothes we wear are made from plastic and synthetic.
Right, okay, of course,
and then you've got the production of that, you've got the transport of that from overseas, so a lot like any product, really.
Cool. So just coming back to that whole framing issue, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts on, because we do, another one of these groups that are sort of popping up is Extinction Rebellion, who are taking more of an activist approach, which is, it's great. It's great to have different voices out there. I mean, one of the things that I wonder about in their approach is, the use of the term climate criminals, and it's very loaded and emotional, and while that might galvanize people to action, I kind of wonder if it might alienate a group of people as well. I mean, does Generation Zero talk about framing like that? About how to how to talk about some of the companies that might be contributing to climate change, that sort of stuff?
It's not. I guess I can offer my personal opinion on where I sort of think about the climate criminals, and I just think we need lots of voices to solve the issue, but to me it feels like more of an end of the line solution, and we're not getting to the heart of the issue. So you can put people in prison, but excuse me, but that's not actually going to contribute to helping solve the problem directly. And it's often you'll have, sure, you might want to put a whole company in prison, but it's going to be one or two people at the top of that company or corporation or government that are thinking and sort of setting the line, the system essentially. And to criminalise people that have probably gone into a space with good intentions or might be even unaware of what they're proliferating, seems wrong to me. I sort of liken it a little bit back to thinking about the textile industry, or like washing your clothes and microfiber plastics, and they've just created this technology where you can put a ball in your washing machine and it'll catch a third of your microfiber plastic. But it's like,
seems really small.
Yeah, but you know, we want to be addressing the problem at the beginning rather than the end.
So I mean, I guess that's what it comes down to. If you're really going to try to out people, it's a question of where you draw the line, right? Because most people in society, and I think the census stats came out today, you know, like the vast majority of Kiwis still have petrol powered cars. Some apparently the same number of families that have, the same number of households that have no car as the same number of households that have 4 cars, which that was quite an incredible statistic. So we are still incredibly dependent on fossil fuels as a society, and it's something I wonder about if we are gonna, if we're gonna say, if we're gonna draw a line, then who's guiltless, really?
Well, none of us are guiltless, but I guess it's about educating people so that they want that change and they know why that change needs to happen. Because you can give someone a penalty and a fine, but that's not. It's not helping it. Where if you can get someone to go, oh, I don't want to own that vehicle anymore because I realise that it's doing this.
And I guess that comes back to your point about painting a positive, view of the future, something that can inspire us to change rather than feeling like we're giving up something. I mean, people hate giving things up, and that's kind of one problem I think that the environmental movements had in the past is a kind of a framing of we have to give stuff up rather than we can move to something better.
Yes. And I strongly believe that we absolutely can move to something better. The systems that we will have in the future are going to far surpass what we're doing now.
So that's kind of the really different groups that have kind of popped up in recent times. Does Generation Zero still feel, I guess, you've had these successes, there's now this, incredible, movement behind things. I mean, where to next for Gen Zero? I mean,
we haven't stopped working. It's just because the zero carbon campaign has sort of reached a point of success. We are working away beavering on the local body elections. So that's they've got a huge amount of work happening. We've got the launch of our scorecards nationally this week. So for the local body elections, we've either interviewed or sent surveys to all the candidates, and then we rate all their answers and give them a scoring. So that is a way of engaging and getting people to be able to have another lens to look at how they vote for and who they vote for in the local body elections.
Nice.
Nice.
Great. Okay, cool.
So that's a huge amount of work there.
Still heaps to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is just the beginning of the changes that we're working on and that need to happen.
And do you think, looking at this week, with the school strike for climate thing rolling out, is there? What's your message to, I guess, to older New Zealanders? I mean, obviously, we've talked about why younger New Zealanders are really taking action. What would be your message? I mean, do you talk about this sort of stuff with your parents or with older friends about the strike? And what would you say to them to try and motivate them to come out on Friday?
Yeah, well, I think a thing to think about is that most parents want for their children a better future than what they've had, and currently that is not possible with the threat of climate change and some of the ways we're acting. So we just need everybody to be on board. No one can afford to not be helping towards the solution. So it's more important than ever for all of our parents and grandparents to be getting on board.
Nice.
Yeah.
And you mentioned local bodies before. Of course, one of the big issues that local bodies have to deal with is arguably is probably bigger than trying to reduce emissions. The issues that local bodies have to face is often around adaptation, like sea level rise. I mean, that's the conversation up on the Kapiti coast at the moment, right? With the local body elections, everyone's talking about whether or not we should build a seawall, which is incredibly expensive and can never. I mean, you can never keep the sea out forever if it's going to keep rising.
Yeah.
So, I mean, given that governments around the world are taking action, but it's not enough really to get us to 2 degrees as yet, let alone sort of the ideal of 1.5. I mean, how do you? Does Gen Zero think about whether they should be talking about adaptation as well as reducing emissions, or is the focus still very much on just reducing emissions?
No, we definitely think there's a place for speaking to both.
Yeah.
Like we focusing on lowering emissions, but also with the rate that we're doing it, we do need to be focusing and having that conversation about adaptation. Yeah. Absolutely.
And are there any sort of views on I mean, it's an incredibly complicated issue, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even more complicated than reducing emissions. Because you've got communities that are facing, for example, sea level rise. They'll of course want to keep their lives the way they are now, but that's going to be impossible to do forever. Like I said, you can only build a seawall so high or so long, or
absolutely. And I think that's where we have the sort of direct impacts of climate change, but we then see all the indirect impacts that will happen, and there's so much adaptation that will need to happen for that as well. It's not just the the sea rising and fires and things. It's all the follow-on things that happen from that when we can't grow crops, when there's just all the migration that will happen because we can't live in certain places. So and then just if those things happen and start to get worse, there's just so many follow-on effects. And if governments can't then sort of, or haven't been able to put things in place, you're at risk of people losing trust, and those societal boundaries starting to break down as well. So there's absolutely a need for thinking about adaptation.
So I mean, and because I mean that personally worries me a little bit as well, because it's great that the conversation about mitigation has started to happen, about reducing emissions, but we're still a long way off, and I think we do need to be starting to think now about how we deal with all of those issues that you mentioned that are coming down the pipeline, and certainly should be affecting where we build houses and build infrastructure right now.
Absolutely, and it's so complex, because it is such a complex issue, because we can't just go, oh, let's rebuild Wellington and make it stronger, because what would the emissions be to do that?
Yeah.
So there's always, we sit within a big framework and a big system, and I think we can't just change one element in a system. Sometimes we have to think about implementing whole new systems, and that's huge.
Yeah. Well, I guess the joining point between mitigation and adaptation in terms of building new stuff would take us down the line of greater densification, which I know Gen Zero have talked about with the sort of transport work that's come out of your organisation, your very prolific organisation. So I guess that's kind of the logical endpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if any new building is happening, of course we want to be looking at where we do that and how we do that in the most sustainable renewable way.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and energy efficient too, right? I mean, it's incredible. I live in a old 1910 house in Wellington, and the thought of having something well insulated that needs almost zero heating would be very alluring to me.
And we've got the other side of that as well. Like we need, if the planet's going to be heating up, we're going to have to think about technology, about how we keep houses cool. As well.
That's right. Yeah. So the other really interesting thing about Gen Zero's work, as we've mentioned, of the groups that are involved in the climate conversation, Gen Zero is the one that's probably dived into the greatest detail and the policy conversations. And there is a bit of a debate going on now about agricultural emissions versus fossil fuel emissions. And the impression I get, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that Gen Zero are sort of saying, well, actually, I mean, we need to reduce all emissions, but fossil fuel has to be the real focus in terms of getting that to zero. I mean, and that kind of makes sense to me. Am I right in thinking that?
So yeah, we do have agricultural and then fossil fuels, but it's more a conversation of the long-lasting gases and the short-lasting gases.
Yeah, right. So that's an important distinction.
Absolutely. So you've got you've got your carbon dioxide, and that's in the atmosphere from 200 to 1,000 years, and then you've got your methane, which is in the atmosphere from sort of 8 to 10 years, and so there's no way that we can deal with that those two things in the same way. And so a lot of the modelling that's done currently, to my understanding, is looking at the next 100 years and creating an average, and by doing that you're discounting that carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere to up to 1,000 years. So if you plant a tree and it's alive for 20 years, great, but what about the rest of those years? So it's definitely needing to look at those in an individual way. It's not actually like this versus this. It's we've got a different problem here to over here. So how do we approach those?
So this is kind of the problem with,
and I think that often gets misinterpreted. Can get misinterpreted as a this versus this. Right. And it's like, no, we're not giving farmers a leaf card or anything by treating methane differently. It's
just that it is a different gas. And has different properties. And so it needs to be treated differently.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. That's really important. So I guess what the unfortunate habit we've slipped into as a society, and as kind of thinking about how to reduce emissions is that we've come up with this way of, as you say, equivalizing all these different gases into a common unit.
Yep.
When actually they're very different beasts.
Yeah, and you can't equivalize something up here to something there.
Yeah.
It's just.
It's just crazy. Yeah. Cool.
And yeah.
So what's so what would be sort of, you know, very briefly the kind of different ways that you think about carbon and methane, then carbon dioxide and methane, in terms of how we deal with them?
Well, we've got a lot of people currently. Our solution and a big way of trying to solve the problem in New Zealand is by planting trees, and in the past that's been planting pine trees, and often they're cut down, so that's not a great long-term solution.
Yeah.
So there is more thinking towards planting native forests. But again, that's still not an ideal solution because we don't know what the impacts of climate change are going to be on our native forests as well. But maybe they'll last 100, 200 years, those forests, but we don't know. And we're also putting more, you know, we're still not reducing those levels at the moment. So we don't. It's hard to know what we are dealing with.
So perhaps put too much emphasis on using forestry as an offset rather than actually just reducing our emissions.
Yes, and I think sometimes by putting forestry there as an offset, it's almost giving an excuse, or we can keep emitting because we've offset by this much, but you've only offset in the framework of looking at those 100 years, and you're not looking into the long term. It's sort of it's looking right now. So I think that's one of the biggest things that we need to be thinking about, and not maybe a thought pattern that we're used to, is thinking about that real long term.
Yeah, I've heard some people say that, you know, their concern is that we could, you know, because New Zealand's got a lot of marginal land, we could plant a lot of trees for the next 50 years and not really have to worry about reducing emissions. But then once we run out of land, it's kind of, then we have to do something then.
And I think that's what we have to come back to, that this is a global issue. And so the solutions that we're looking at, we have to always keep that in the back of our minds. Building a little bunker or castle is not going to help. You know?
However tempting that may be.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm ready to open it up for questions if anyone in the crowd has some questions.
Sure. I mean, I suppose my question comes to in phrasing this, having people recognise that there is a natural flux of carbon that happens, but ultimately the reason it's a problem is we've dug so much of it out of the ground, and talking to the ramifications of the Zero Carbon Act, in that the value of sequestering this carbon both above ground, but how ultimately we fix that balance, that we reach peak carbon and bring that down. I suppose just in terms of framing questions, framing discussions with people about like how you have them recognise that it's where these emissions are coming from.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's why I really like the term fossil fuels, because they actually they are fossils, you know, and you know, munched up dinosaurs, basically. I mean, you know, that's being a little bit pejorative, but they really are, and so all of that carbon has been locked away for thousands of years, millions of years, and now we're letting it out at a far greater rate than our natural cycles can deal with.
Yeah, I think in some ways it is a good way of framing it to make people understand just that we were never meant to have that much carbon and fossil fuels just taken out of the earth.
Yeah.
And so then to re-put that into balance. And then we face the question of ways in which we can do that, and how much energy it would take to do them, and yeah, research into that is probably more research and work needs to go into that.
And I guess that's sort of a rabbit hole that not a lot of people think about, is kind of as you say, and you kind of mentioned it when you were talking about transforming our cities too. It takes energy to do all that stuff as well.
Yeah.
And if we're trying to give up our reliance on fossil fuels, then, so for example, I mean, it takes energy to build a wind turbine.
Yeah.
And potentially there's fossil fuels in a wind turbine, right? I mean, so we have to transition to new ways of operating
Absolutely. It's like when people are getting so excited about electric cars, and it's like, yeah, great, but that's still encouraging building roads.
Yeah.
And building roads just creates so many emissions. So
yeah. In themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, and building the electric cars currently still too. But
yeah. And then what do you do with the end product? So
yeah. So ultimately, a lot of this has to be about more efficient use of energy, rather than just taking our current lifestyle and electrifying it.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
We have to get more efficient at the same time. Hence.
Yeah, the lifestyles that we're going to be living are going to look different from what they're living now.
Yeah. But again.
But that's exciting. I don't. The way we're living now is not perfect by any means. So I think there's so much potential and so many opportunities and for just new ideas.
Yeah. I mean, I believe that rates of mental illness in suburbia are higher, right, than in high quality dense living. So I mean obviously that we've kind of, thanks to fossil fuels, we've kind of developed this very insular, distant way of living, which may not actually be very good for us. So that's one example I can think of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Cool. Any other queries?
Just in terms of things that you're doing now, in terms of, you said you were talking to candidates in the local body.
Yes.
And got some questions for them, and you're going to rate them and sort of publish that information. Do you have plans for next year's general election? What is your approach going to be then?
That's something that we're talking about at the moment, but I'm not going to talk about.
Top secret. Top secret. Yeah. But last time I believe Gen Zero did create a scorecard. I think in 2017.
I'm not sure.
I think so. It's hard to remember because they definitely do around local body elections all the time. So it's and I think ultimately, that's a really powerful role to be able to provide that information for people. Because I mean, again, full disclosure, I've actually voted in the local body election, so I won't be waiting for your scorecard, but you look through that little booklet and it's it's pretty useless. I mean, in terms of what people are saying, about their policies. I mean, it doesn't really help you make any sort of decision unless you actually know the people involved.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why we're doing it. So yeah, for anyone watching, check out the scorecards to vote for the climate.
Can you tell us what you're going to be rating them on in this local body scorecard? Are there different criteria that you? Yeah,
so we've got different criteria for that. I haven't worked on the policy side of this, but you'll be able to see it this week.
This week?
Yeah.
Awesome. Do you know what day?
This week.
This week?
This week.
Keep an eye out.
Yeah.
We've got another question?
So the climate crisis has also been described more recently as the climate and ecological crisis, and I saw a talk recently where they talked around basically how you value nature, and what you talked before about the benefits to this, and it seems like one of the common ways we talk about is essentially commercial operations But really, I suppose I'm asking, like in terms of land use, like, well, in New Zealand, a lot of it would be farmland that would be trying to convince people to use, but sort of the secondary benefit of nature and the use of it. Is there any view of how land use should change and how the public maybe can share in the benefit to that and gain that additional value of that nature?
Yeah, I mean, while you're thinking about a response, Monique, I mean, just one thing I could throw in there is that, I mean, the government has recently brought out some proposals around freshwater changes, and people were and these proposals aren't perfect. I mean, they don't really know how they're going to be implemented as yet, but if these proposals were to be implemented, I mean, it would swamp the impact of bringing agriculture into the emissions trading scheme as the government is currently proposing to do with its sort of 95% get out of jail free card. So these things are hugely interrelated. Is the point that I'm trying to make. If you do something with fresh water, you do something positive with fresh water, it's going to help climate and it's going to help biodiversity. And the same for any of the others. There's such huge crossovers with land use.
Sorry, I was just going to say that really goes, I think, to my point. Freshwater as an example, we have lots of keen fishermen in New Zealand. It's a big draw for tourism. So sort of, in terms of world view of how we can adapt, like examples like that of improving our environment, and then there's the value of nature's a lot better off, but then we could still get the opportunity to enjoy it as opposed to eroding land use for commercial uses.
We just have to prioritise the environment. I think so often we think of us, the environment over here and us over here, but essentially we are a part of it. We're drinking the water.
Yeah.
There's nothing else to say.
Yeah.
It's
a massive issue in Canterbury, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's
we drink the water if we want to swim in rivers.
Yeah. We've got to do something about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it will bring, and those actions will bring climate benefits as well.
Yeah.
I think that sort of argument is a really powerful one going forward that we have to get across to people. And I think the trouble is in New Zealand is that where we've kind of got our growth from in the past has tended to be from the land, just by farming more intensively, putting cows on the side of the Southern Alps, all that sort of stuff.
I like to think of it as the metaphor of the seasons, and we've almost just gone for spring the whole time, and it's just not possible. You have to have that full circle of some of the older ways of thinking of agriculture, where you let the land rest, and if you're constantly putting more into it, it's got to go somewhere.
But also giving yourself those limits, I think, encourages innovation. I mean, when you look at some of the countries that have really strong environmental limits, that has really pushed people to do different things and innovate and add value to milk and create IT industries or whatever. It's encouraged greater innovation simply by putting limits on how much we can just extract value from Mother Nature.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fact that we've still got permits going ahead for coal mines and things like that, there's some of those baseline things that was just like, we need a cut.
It's pretty, given all that we know, it's pretty astounding that we're still digging coal out of the ground. It's
that's why we're here. That's why we're doing this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Any last questions?
Just in terms of an urban setting, I've heard a lot of talk about regenerative agriculture as a way, and there's been examples like Kaicycle and for the Love of Bees in Auckland. I just wondered if Generation Zero had any comments on how they could involve people in those sorts of ways, increasing soil carbon.
Yeah, so we've definitely got a lot of conversation around education now, and I think that comes into it, is how we can get local communities working together, as opposed to some things falling back to having like a council system that's picking up our compost, but how can we get individuals or communities working together a little bit like we used to. Everyone used to have their own compost heap.
Yeah.
So yeah, creating strength within local communities, so they're taking sort of power and action to make themselves strong, as opposed to it all, so just all coming from the government or relying on that.
I think that's really powerful. You know?
Yeah.
Again, that's kind of part of that future vision that you're talking about of doing things in a different way, ways that can bring us together. You know.
Absolutely.
Separate us out. I think that
it's a fine balance between people taking individual responsibility and then the systemic change of changing systems, and it's those things meeting together.
Yeah, I mean, out the back of my place, for instance, we've got a whole bunch of backyards that kind of meet in one area, and you could totally see. I mean, you know, some people use their backyards, some people don't. We've got all these blooming fences between them. I mean, wouldn't it be great if we just got rid of the fences and had a compost heap?
What's stopping you?
Well, exactly. I was talking to my neighbours, I suppose. It's that kind of, we have that kind of cringe about doing that sort of stuff, but we need to do it more.
I think, the climate change requires a new kind of courage of all of us to step up and find new solutions, try new things.
There you go, I've been told. Awesome. Hey, well, thank you so much, Monique. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And remember, this week is the Strike for Climate on Friday the 27th, all over the country. There'll be events near you, no doubt, but if you're in Wellington, we'll see you at Civic Square or the bridge above it, just before 11 a.m. Kia ora.